day, on the second day of Chag HaBikurim, the festival of the first fruits. So Numbers 28 remind us it is a strange agricultural festival, not named Shavuot in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. We have Pesach, we have Sukkot, the Feast of Passover, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Shavuot is the third pilgrimage festival, but it's really a day linked to counting days after Passover. 50 days beyond Passover, this becomes the late spring, early summer harvest festival. Theodore Gaster, the wonderful historian of religious practice, ancient Israel was a solar, seasonal, nomadic faith. Add now scripture and history, and you change merely solar, seasonal, agricultural pilgrimage festivals to freedom, and today, revelation. It is customary to read the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments on Shavuot, because that was the day that God gave his people the 10 commandments, the law on Mount Sinai.
All this we will do and more.
Yes, and that idea that the purpose of freedom, the purpose of liberation, the purpose of redemption was to get the people to Mount Sinai. And Shavuot is that day where we now say, okay, we understand we were enslaved, but we're now a people covenantally linked to a God who reveals order in a world of chaos. Sound familiar?
That's good. That's good. I was in California. I was invited to do a lecture for a series called Gospel Freedom. And so I tried to subvert their expectations a little bit by presenting freedom as being revealed the true God and conscripted into service of him.
Sounds rabbinic to me, Pastor.
So does in your tradition, does Shavuot have the eschatological undertones that it takes on in Christianity?
No. Pentecost, Transfiguration. No, you count 50 days beyond the time he comes out of the grave, and then moves to the next threshold, confirming the Christos nature of his identity. We don't have any of that. We focus on the giving of Torah. And it is called in the liturgy, Zman Matan Torah. This is the time when we were given Torah. Reform, non-Orthodox Jews like to add the idea, was not merely given Torah, but Kabbalat Torah. We received Torah too. We participated in the nature. The covenant is always engaged with, so God gave and we accepted.
Okay.
Rabbinically,
okay, go ahead.
No, rabbinically, a book of the Bible is added, a small book, a Megillah. The book of Ruth is traditionally read on Shavuot. That does have an eschatological, a very linked part of the genealogy of who will become King David.
It's funny you say that. I had a conversation with Chris Green, who is a theologian and a bishop in a charismatic Anglican tradition. But he just released a book on a Christological reading of the Old Testament. And one of the comments he made in our conversation was that the book of Ruth, for Christians at least, the book of Ruth gives us a glimpse of what the fulfillment looks like, in that the book of Ruth has drama but no conflict. And so it gives you a taste of what an eschatological life might look like. And that
Interesting.
Yeah, that added a depth to the book that I don't know I appreciated before.
But I would then have to say, eschatological, no conflict. It comes in a book about women and their relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Boaz plays a central figure, but minor compared to Ruth and Naomi. So maybe, if he's right, the no conflict element of the eschaton is anchored in the way women have a relationship.
Well, it's not dissimilar to Karl Barth insisting that the virgin birth is God's judgment on the history of men.
That's wonderful. That's right. I think the Book of Ruth is a fascinating book because Ruth, of course, is a Moabite.
Mm-hmm.
Moab is a nation that is produced in Genesis 19 in the very enigmatic, strange, drunken act of incest between Lot and his eldest daughter, and is one of the 7 nations that early in the Bible Israel is prohibited from. And yet Ruth is the model of those who choose to be Jews.
Mm-hmm.
We refer to Ruth's famous, "Your God will be my God, your people will be my people, and where you go, I will go." We quote that very often when people choose Judaism. And I always wonder, how interesting that the paradigm, the paragon of those who are on the outside and choose to come in comes from something no one wants to ever talk about or think about.
Yeah. Doesn't Moab mean from dad?
Yeah. So
it's a little on the nose.
I think the text requires, even at the quote most literal level, which neither of us like, you better stop and pay attention to how you read this. You cannot read this and just skim over it. Mm-hmm. So Moab, from dad. Okay, moving right along.
I remember years ago when I was a prison chaplain, Sister Rose, the nun who was in charge, she brought in material for a Jesse tree that some Baptists had given her. And so the idea was that we were going to, there were ornaments, and each of them were labeled with a name from Jesus's family tree, and that we would have the inmates pick an ornament. I would say a little bit about the character, and then they would hang it on. And one after another, they picked the most embarrassing stories to like it just devolved into chaos at that point.
Right.
So,
and let us talk about Sister Tamar. So a minor festival, 2 days. All the other festivals are 7 or 8 days. It doesn't provide any of the drama. You used that word before, that Passover or Sukkot, Freedom and Tabernacles has for us. But I think it's a way of remembering, before we had anything to define where we are when we're there, what it was like to create a religious communal calendar. You counted days, 50 days, 49 days, and then you give sacrifices. What an amazing act of communal discipline.
Um, so having just been to synagogue, I'm wondering how the holiday intersected with the not release, rescue of some hostages in Gaza.
You know, it's very interesting. I had no idea you will ask me that, but I took my phone out to take a picture of a passage from the liturgy. Or Chadash al Sion Ta'ir, a new light will form, will illuminate Zion. And I thought about that the whole service. What is that new light? What could possibly illuminate Zion? This small mountain hill inside a city. I Yes, 4 Israeli hostages, captives, were found, were taken back to freedom, and Palestinians died in the rescue attempt. And once again, Israel is publicly, internationally criticized for the nature of bringing its citizens back to safety because they had to do it in a context of war where they were shot at and attempts were made to kill the hostages. Um, the festivals, all of them since October 7th, um, have a somber note. What are we celebrating? Uh, Today, on the second day of Shavuot, is Yizkor, a day of memorializing. We do that 4 times a year. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the end of Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, which was the day of the massacre, Passover and Shavuot. And I thought about the young member of the Israeli Special Forces who died trying to save 4 of his fellow citizens. The amount of death since October 7th is just beyond counting.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as an American expat living in Brazil, I asked my grandchildren to tell me, what did you learn about this holiday? Nothing is linked in their Jewish day schools to what's going on in Israel. But I spoke to a friend yesterday in Israel who said when the hostages were freed, everyone went home and became glued to the TV.
I'm sure.
And then I read of the vile, disgusting anti Semitism in New York City and especially in Brooklyn. What kind of world are we in that on the day I remember the revelation at Mount Sinai and go to the synagogue to remember those in my family and those I have buried as a rabbi, I have to be afraid about not just the state of Israel in all of its terrible complexity, but I have to be afraid there are Jews living anywhere in the world who are afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm leaving Monday to see my children and then going to Dublin. And people have asked me, are you afraid of going to Ireland? You're giving a paper in Ireland. Are you concerned? Ireland? Well, the Irish recognize the Palestinian state. Am I missing something that I should be afraid? Am I naive? I don't know about the times in which we're living. and continue to wonder if we should be raising our children and grandchildren to be more serious about how they understand fear.
Hmm.
But I don't want my grandchildren raised in an bubble of anxiety. Until this war ends, until all the hostages and those who died, their remains are brought back to Israel, and until the IDF has left Gaza, all of us will be in a state of constant stress. And the question you ask, can we celebrate? And my answer is no, we observe.
Hmm.
I can't celebrate. There is a lack of the momentum of joy. Again, during the service, there is the Hallel, the traditional reading of Psalm 113 to 118, and I refuse to pray those words, praising God. I don't want to link God and that kind of theology to what's going on in Gaza. One side has God, one God doesn't. And a member of the IDF dies, but the hostages are free. I can't participate in that. So, long answer, as usual, from the rabbi. Uh, I observe the festival, but I can't celebrate it. I think the same is true in Israel. We can't deny the nature of the calendar. The calendar requires us to be aware.
Can you talk a little bit about the um, um, cabinet disruptions that happened in Israel over this past week?
In Israel, there is a parliamentary government. There is no direct vote for prime minister or any other office. You vote for parties, and in 120 seats, you will get a government if your party is able to put a coalition of more than 61 together. The current coalition has 64 seats. Benjamin Netanyahu is the leader of the Likud party, and he heads the government. On Sunday night, Benny Gantz, who was part of the previous government, a more centrist figure, a past chief of the Israel Defense Forces, left the war council, left the war cabinet, because he demanded that Netanyahu provide the public with the plans for the day after. And Netanyahu refuses. Um, Netanyahu is in a coalition of the most right wing parties ever in the 75-year history of the state of Israel. And I don't mean right wing conservative, I mean a group of ultra Orthodox rabbis and Jews who this past week passed a initial resolution piece of legislation that exempts ultra Orthodox men from the requirement of serving in the Israel Defense Forces.
So where are they at on IVF? Just reading the Southern Baptist News in the paper.
They're they're not opposed to it. The Jewish community is usually alongside science that enhances life. On issues of termination of life, even the most ultra Orthodox rabbi does not recognize life as life until the head and right shoulder come out. So even the most ultra Orthodox rabbi doesn't accept life at conception. So that theology that made them oppose isn't a part of our world at all.
Okay, so if you're a Southern Baptist listening to this, you should be embarrassed.
He's trying to get me to say something. I don't understand how any religious community can deny a couple its opportunity to bring life into the world.
Yep.
Don't get it.
Yeah, I know. My niece would not be here were it not for that.
So, so Gantz left because he's not a part of the 64 seats in the coalition. So nothing in the government was weakened. He left a special wartime cabinet. People shouldn't think anything about the Netanyahu government has changed in principle. It has not, in no way.
Because that is how it was initially portrayed in the press here.
Yes, that's because very few people understand there is no direct access that the people have to a government. A government is mandated only through parties. And once the parties agree to be in coalition, so you have the ultra right wing Messianic religious Zionists, the Kahanis, Ben Gvir and Schmorch, who are literally out of their mind. Literally out of their mind. They have threatened Netanyahu that if he signs a new ceasefire, they will leave the government. So he passed legislation that exempts ultra Orthodox from serving. So imagine all the people whose children are serving, whose children have died. And these young men go to school to study and are supported by Israeli tax dollars. What part of that picture in the 21st century don't I get?
I remember I was in Israel 2 years ago, and Brian Zond, who I was with, explained to me this very dynamic of the Orthodox being exempt from military service, and the relative birth rates of the two groups.
Right.
And I remember thinking to myself, well, like, that's not sustainable. The one group is going to resent the other,
and they do already, and especially after this war, which was initiated by a massacre, and so many Israelis have died. How is it that you are going to go study scripture without any access to the modern secular world that provides the money for you to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Look, we are facing forces of theocracy everywhere. And those of us who are components of religious communities, this is where we have to start the conversation. Theocracy. The stress on open, modern, religious role in democracy. That's what we want. But theocracy, no, we don't want theocracy.
Well, it's interesting. I was making a joke about the Southern Baptist Convention earlier, but it's just it's revealing. It says a lot about a certain kind of Christian nationalism that is popular now, or seems to be popular now. That here you have a Christian denomination who are all on board with the Pledge of Allegiance and any manner of social issue gesturing, virtue signaling. And yet at the same time, they are uncomfortable with affirming the Nicene Creed, which is kind of, one of our bare minimum statements of faith. And so it seems increasingly to be less about the faith and more about the extreme ideology.
And the prohibition of women serving lost by a thread.
Mm-hmm. Strange times.
I don't understand why we keep coming back to the clear and obvious challenge that Scripture and God as we know God in the pluralism of experiences. How do we keep coming back to the same questions we've been asking for what? I don't know, give or take 1,500 years?
Yeah, and I'm sure you can think of examples from Scripture, but one of the things I come back to when people ask questions about, like the sexuality debate and things like that, is that built into the New Testament and the Book of Acts is the notion that the Spirit is at work out ahead of the church, independent of or in contradiction to the text. So it's biblical to expect the Spirit to do something that confounds your understanding of Scripture, and that's just the case, because otherwise, Scripture just becomes a stable book that we can use to argue and advocate positions we've arrived at prior to engaging the text.
And every text has a context.
Mm-hmm.
And every reader brings his or her context to the act of reading the other context.
Well, it's interesting. I was reading on the plane to California. I was reading Karl Barth, and one of the things people don't like about Barth is in the Church Dogmatics, when he insists that there are no universal laws in Scripture. There are only commands. That be fruitful and multiply, for example, was a command given for that particular time to populate the earth. And so there are no universal laws that you can look at independent of a relationship with God. They're just commands given to individuals who are seeking to be obedient in the moment.
And narratives that are, if we are honest and grateful, mirrors in which we should find ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about women. Numbers 20 is the single best chapter. And Miriam dies there. That's it. What? The last 5 verses are all about Aaron going to the top of the mountain, having his vestments removed, dies, is brought back up, and they mourn for 30 days. Look at the opening verse and the closing 5 verses. What? And no, there's an asymmetry there that has nothing to do with our time.
Well, it's funny you say so. It's I'm about to do a long sermon series through Paul's letter to the Romans, and most people don't realize, because Paul buries it at the very end of the letter, that he has dictated this letter to a woman named Phoebe and then given it to her to take to Rome, presumably to interpret it for them. And so, like, yeah, the notion, the retrograde notion that people have of women's leadership is it's done, I think, with really sloppy readings of the text.
Let's go back to Chava, Eve. She changed all humankind. She made a decision. Whether or not the decision to eat from the tree of moral knowledge was a sin, okay, but it was a decision that made us beings of moral discernment. I understand what Augustine does to it. The rabbis also spend. But women, maybe it's because I have 3 daughters, I don't know. How can there ever be a religious community that votes on women's service? I will not lead a prayer service in a congregation that divides men and women, Jason. In a traditional Jewish synagogue, men don't sit next to women because men are unable to control their otherwise libidinal distraction. So women are put behind a screen or up in a balcony. How is it that we're still doing this? I don't know. Don't know. I hope my brothers and sisters in the Southern Baptists will um, will guide and help those whose seeking of life in their family are now cruelly rejected from their churches. What would you do? You've taken this vote and you go back, and there's a couple waiting for you in your office. Here is the photo we were just given of the child science helped us create. You did our marriage, Pastor.
Mm-hmm.
I am certain the Holy One weeps every time we do something that excludes each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and it's well, I mean, both of us, right? So each community has a particular vocation, and the vocation is not to. Um, I just think we miss the forest from the trees.
Yes.
That the vocation is not to have the right position on issue X, Y, or Z. It's to bear witness to not ourselves.
Right. I had not thought of that scenario until I blurted it out. But what a painful moment for our brothers and sisters in the clergy serving that community. How can you know that a frozen embryo is life? I don't know. It's the certainty with which all these votes are taken, like the certainty of everything that those encampments meant.
Well, and it's I was talking about this with someone recently. I mean, the language about abortion on the left makes me uncomfortable, and I largely agree with the Catholic Church's tapestry of life ethic. But I think it's Bonhoeffer who talks about how Christians have to be as practical and commonsensical as they can when it comes to ethical matters, which is a very Jewish way of thinking about it. And like it always strikes me that if reducing the number of abortions is really a conviction that you hold dear, then it should matter. For example, that abortions were at their lowest when President Obama was in office. That what you say you want and ideologically how it is accomplished don't match up. And so, what do you want? Do you want the numbers to go down, or do you just want the ideological win?
Well, and that question, do you want the ideological win, should be superimposed on 90% of all conversations about everything.
Yeah.
When we're talking about life, at how people choose to be engaged with life as a couple, I think we have to come at this with greater humility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And our lack of humility, our political certainty that has made this now the stuff of shaming and vulgar, at the worst kind of human level, vulgar exclusion. So a big convention in Indiana voted, we're opposed to this. What do you mean? Do you mean that there may be people in this room who were in fact created through that mechanism? Do you mean you're opposed to them?
Yeah. And what does that even mean? Yeah.
I think there was a revelation. I'm not at all sure about the content of the revelation. I agree with the argument Buber and Rosenzweig had that the event, Vayered Adonai al Har Sinai, and the Lord descended upon the mount, whatever that means, whatever that event in ancient history meant. Vayomer, God said, and all the rest is interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can embrace revelation, I can embrace, and on the third day, the cave was open and he was gone. I want to embrace the unknown. And the people who come at all these topics with certainty don't let me share it because there's no more unknown.
So you're about to travel. Do you want to give us a preview of your talk in Dublin?
I do. I am speaking on memories of abuse and abusive memories. I am speaking about Paul Ricoeur's last great important memory, History Forgetting, the epilogue, Forgiving.
Okay.
I'm doing a Jewish Christian dialogue with my partner, James Moore, and we are talking about how one lives with memories if our goal is living together. And I'm opening my paper with the conflict and scandal of the photo of the year taken by the AP of a group of Hamas terrorists dragging the body of Soni Luke from the rave to Gaza. They would find out later that she had probably already died, as they found part of her skull. But her body was shown being held up as a trophy of the October 7th massacre, and her remains were kept. Many people found the photo unbearable and should not have been given the photo of the year. I quote Susan Sontag about the power of photos, and they become permanent texts. And there are photos that we all know. Think of the photo of the Vietnam person being shot point blank, or the girl covered in napalm. Photos that are, in fact, determinant of history. And her father said, I'm glad the photo was taken. I'm glad it was acknowledged. Many Jewish women were particularly disgusted that this defamed a woman, much like the massive acts of rape in the massacre. Now we have this photo. Is it a memory of abuse, or will it become an abusive memory? How do we live philosophically, religiously. And my part of the dialogue is I look at Amalek in the Bible and ask whether evil comes now from within the clan. Amalek is introduced in Exodus 17. After the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, Exodus 15, Pharaoh and his army are destroyed. Exodus 16 is all about hunger. We want to eat something. Manna, quail. You've been freed from 430 years of slavery, and all you can do is whine about why did you leave Egypt? Beginning of Exodus 17, water, me meribah, the waters of bitterness. And the second part of the chapter, totally non-introduced, no background. We have to fight Amalek. And you'll remember it's a strange scene in which the only way they can win is for Moses to hold his staff up. And two people have to hold his arms up in order for the battle to take place. Who is Amalek? Amalek is the grandson of Esau, born of Timnah and Eliphaz. There's a rabbinic legend that Timnah came and wanted to become a Jew, and she was rejected. And so she said, fine, I'll have a child as the concubine of Esau's grandchild. There is a passage in rabbinic literature that says that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says the halacha, the law is Esau hates Jacob. So I ask the question from within Scripture. Is living together? Esau hates Jacob. Amalek becomes and has been quoted now to be compared to Hamas. Is there a scriptural, philosophical, theological path out of eternal, completely unredeemable hatred? We don't offer answers, my partner and I. I can send you the text that I'll read. What I want to do is create dialogue and conversations.
Where are you having this dialogue?
In Dublin, at the Dublin University. And there might be some anti-Zionists present. I've thought about that. We lectured at a conference in London last June and had problems with anti-Zionism. I'm not going to have the secure, safe, engaging, respectful dialogue that I've had with you over the past 7.5 months. My hope is that in a Recour conference about memory, history, forgetting, I can put forward a new set of questions, which is what Recour wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Let me quote one of the most important passages that Recour gives us that's even in my paper. The question is then posed, is a sensible politics possible without something like a censure of memory? Political prose begins where vengeance ceases. If history is not to remain locked up within a deadly oscillation between eternal hatred and forgetful memory, a society cannot be continually angry with itself. I'm just picking something light and, inconsequential to talk about.
It's, I mean, just this idea, yeah. I mean, you're reminding me how Saint Augustine wrote speculatively about how the departed in heaven have no memory of the harm done to them, which I don't think holds water theologically, but he's trying to get at the same thing.
Well, look, let's talk about memory in our country. Well, how is it that Juneteenth can now be a federal holiday? And it should be. Okay, I get it. But the population at large can't remember 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This idea of memory, I was asked yesterday by a friend who's finishing. She sent me a passage. You'll like this because you mentioned Augustine. Ricoeur writes, "Will it not be the task of a memory instructed by history to preserve the trace of this speculative history over the centuries and to integrate it into its symbolic universe? The palace of memory we have read in Augustine's Confessions not only holds the memories of events, the rules of grammar, the rhetorical examples, it also preserves theories, including those that, claiming to embrace it, have threatened to eliminate it." Memory and history. I think I went to the synagogue today to share a sacred moment of memory with those who preceded me, my parents, my sister, many in my life who've touched my life, to remember them, Yiskor. And I was brought back into Scripture's moment of historical revelation. This memory history, we can't get out of it. And we're not talking about it. We don't want to spend the time to wrestle with its complexity. We'll just take a vote and be certain about the vote.
So when do you travel to Ireland?
Monday, I go to see my children in New York, and then a week later I go to Ireland. So I think for a couple weeks we'll have to anticipate what we're going to give each other on my return. And I think it's important that we start asking each other as often as we can to model to those who listen to us, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm. Well,
what did that vote mean in Indiana? What did God mean at Sinai?
Well, blessings on your trip. Send along the paper. I'd like to read it.
I will. Did you get that contact for you to send?
Yes.
Good.